What if the Spanish conquered all of Europe? October 19, 1571. The waters off the coast of Greece. Over 400 warships clash in what will become known as the Battle of Lepanto. On one side, the Holy League, a coalition led by Spain and Venice. On the other, the Ottoman Empire. For hours, the battle rages, cannons roar, ships burn, thousands die. By evening, the Holy League has won a decisive victory. Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean is broken. This battle is remembered as one of the most significant naval engagements in history. It marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. It secured Christian control of the Mediterranean. But what if Lepanto had been more than a defensive victory? What if it had been the beginning of something far larger? What if Spain, at the height of its power in the 16th century, had not simply defended Europe, but conquered it? Spain in the 1500s was a superpower. It controlled vast territories in the Americas, bringing back silver and gold in quantities that dwarfed the treasuries of other European kingdoms. It ruled the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and territories across the globe. Its armies were the most disciplined and feared in Europe. Its navy dominated the seas. The Habsburg dynasty, ruling from Madrid and Vienna, controlled more of Europe than any power since Rome. But Spain never unified Europe under its banner. Religious conflicts, overextension, and resistance from France, England, and other powers prevented it. By the 17th century, Spain was in decline, exhausted by endless wars and unable to maintain its empire. But what if Spain had succeeded? What if, through a combination of military victories, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, the Spanish Habsburgs had brought all of Europe under their control? What if the continent that would later colonize much of the world had itself been united under a single Catholic monarchy based in Madrid? This is not a story about endless conquest. Spain couldn't have simply invaded and occupied every European nation. But through careful use of dynastic politics, military pressure, and the immense wealth flowing from the Americas, Spain could have created a European empire. And that empire would have changed everything. The balance of global power, the development of democracy, the course of colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, and the entire trajectory of the modern world. Let's explore how this could have happened, and what the world would look like today if Spain had unified Europe under the banner of the cross and the crown. To understand how Spain could have conquered Europe, we need to understand Spain's position in the 16th century. The Spanish Empire was built on several foundations. First, dynastic politics. Through carefully arranged marriages, the Habsburg family accumulated an extraordinary collection of territories. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and Spain's American colonies. His realm was said to be one on which the sun never set. Second, American wealth. Spanish conquistadors had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, gaining access to enormous quantities of silver and gold. Mines in Potosi and Zacatecas produced treasure that funded Spanish military campaigns across Europe. Third, military superiority. The Spanish tercios, infantry formations combining pikemen and arquebusiers, were the most effective military units of their time. Spanish armies won victory after victory across Europe in the early 16th century. But Spain also faced challenges. Religious conflict divided Europe. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, split Christianity. Much of Northern Europe became Protestant, while the South remained Catholic. Spain, as the defender of Catholicism, found itself at war with Protestant powers. Spain also faced determined rivals. France, Spain's neighbor and traditional enemy, resisted Spanish encirclement. England, after breaking with Rome, opposed Spanish Catholicism. The Ottoman Empire threatened from the east. In our timeline, these challenges proved insurmountable. But what if Spain had made different choices? What if key battles had gone differently? What if the wealth from America had been used more effectively? Let's construct an alternate timeline where Spain succeeds. The divergence point comes in the 1580s and 90s. In our timeline, Spain suffered several critical setbacks during this period. The Dutch revolt, beginning in 1568, drained Spanish resources for decades. The Spanish Armada, sent to invade England in 1588, was destroyed by storms and English ships. And wars with France consumed men and money without decisive victory. But what if these campaigns had succeeded? Let's imagine that in 1588, the Spanish Armada isn't destroyed by storms. The weather is calmer. The fleet reaches England intact. Spanish troops land on English shores, and after several months of campaigning, defeat Elizabeth III's forces. England becomes a Spanish client state. A Catholic monarch, perhaps a Spanish prince, is installed on the English throne. This is a monumental shift. England, which in our timeline became a major power and eventually built the largest empire in history, is instead subjugated. English wealth, English ships, and English manpower are now at Spain's disposal. With England secured, Spain turns to the Netherlands. In our timeline, the Dutch revolt succeeded in creating an independent Dutch republic. But in this alternate timeline, with England no longer supporting the rebels, the revolt is crushed by 1595. The Netherlands remains under Spanish control. France is next. France in the late 16th century was weakened by religious civil wars. Catholics and Protestants fought for control. Spain, supporting the Catholic faction, intervenes more decisively than in our timeline. By 1600, a Spanish-backed Catholic dynasty controls France. It's not outright conquest. France remains nominally independent, but it's firmly in Spain's sphere of influence. By 1610, Spain controls or dominates Spain itself. Portugal, which was already united with Spain in 1580, the Netherlands, England, much of Italy, and has France as a client state. The Holy Roman Empire, which includes German territories and Austria, is ruled by the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, closely allied with Spain. The only major European powers outside Spanish control are the Scandinavian kingdoms, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. And the Ottoman Empire threatens from the southeast, but Spain is the dominant power on the continent, and over the next century, that dominance will deepen. Controlling territory is one thing. Consolidating control is another. In the 17th century, Spain works to integrate its European holdings into a unified empire. This is done through several mechanisms. First, political integration. The various kingdoms and territories retain some local autonomy, as was traditional in early modern Europe, but ultimate authority rests with the king in Madrid. A sophisticated bureaucracy manages the empire, with viceroys and governors appointed to oversee regions. The Council of State, meeting in Madrid, coordinates policy across the empire. Second, religious uniformity. Spain is fervently Catholic. The Spanish Inquisition, infamous for its persecution of heretics, is extended across Spanish-controlled Europe. Protestantism is suppressed. In England and the Netherlands, where Protestantism had taken root, there are forced conversions, exiles, and executions. By the mid-17th century, Protestantism survives only in Scandinavia, parts of Germany outside Spanish control, and underground networks. This religious uniformity has profound effects. In our timeline, the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation generated intellectual and cultural dynamism, debates about faith, authority, and individual conscience that contributed to the eventual development of Enlightenment thinking. In this timeline, that diversity is crushed. Europe becomes religiously monolithic, dominated by a single Catholic orthodoxy enforced by the Spanish crown and the Church. Third, economic integration. The wealth from American silver flows through Spain to the rest of Europe. But Spain also develops mercantilist policies designed to keep wealth within the empire. Trade between Spanish territories is encouraged. Trade with outsiders is restricted. A single currency, based on Spanish silver, circulates across the empire. Fourth, military presence. Spanish armies are garrisoned throughout Europe. The tercios, supplemented by troops from across the empire, maintain order. Local resistance movements, which periodically flare up, are suppressed. The empire is held together by force as much as by consent. By 1650, the Spanish European Empire is an established reality. It's not universally loved. Many people, particularly in England, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, resent Spanish rule. But resistance is difficult. The empire is powerful, wealthy, and ruthless in suppressing dissent. And this unified Europe has global consequences. In our timeline, European colonialism was a competitive enterprise. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all established colonies. They competed for territory, trade, and resources. This competition drove exploration and, eventually, the colonization of much of the world. But in the timeline where Spain dominates Europe, colonialism is less competitive. Spain, controlling most of Europe's colonial powers, can coordinate colonial efforts. The Portuguese colonies in Brazil, Africa, and Asia are already under Spanish control since 1580. The Dutch colonies in the East Indies and the Americas, which in our timeline became major holdings, are also Spanish. And England, which would have colonized North America and India, is now a Spanish client. By the mid-17th century, Spanish authority extends over much of the Americas, parts of Africa, trading posts in India and Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. It's the largest colonial empire in history to that point. But there are limits. The distance and difficulty of governing such vast territories means that local populations often have significant autonomy. Indigenous peoples in the Americas resist Spanish rule, though they face overwhelming military and demographic pressures. In Asia, Spanish influence is limited to coastal trading posts. Interior regions remain under local control. The economic model of this empire is extractive. The primary goal is to send resources, silver, gold, sugar, tobacco, spices, back to Europe. This creates enormous wealth for Spain and its European holdings. But it also creates dependence. The economy becomes oriented around extraction rather than manufacturing or innovation. And this has long-term consequences for Europe's development. In our timeline, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century. It was driven by several factors: access to coal and iron, a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, capital accumulated through trade and colonialism, and a relatively free economic and political system that encouraged investment and risk-taking. But in the timeline where Spain dominates Europe, industrialization is delayed. Why? Several reasons. First, economic structure. Spain's mercantilist empire is designed to extract wealth from colonies and maintain a rigid economic hierarchy. Manufacturing is not encouraged. The empire wants raw materials from the colonies and finished goods produced in Spain. This creates little incentive for innovation or industrial development. Second, political culture. Spain in this timeline is an absolutist monarchy. Power is centralized. Dissent is suppressed. There's little room for the kind of entrepreneurial experimentation that drove industrialization in our timeline. Would-be innovators face bureaucratic obstacles and often require royal approval for ventures. Third, intellectual climate. The Catholic Church, aligned with the Spanish crown, controls education and intellectual life. The Inquisition suppresses ideas deemed heretical or dangerous. Scientific inquiry is constrained. Universities teach theology and classical texts, but are less open to new ideas. The kind of scientific revolution that occurred in 17th century Europe with figures like Galileo, Newton, and others challenging traditional ideas is muted in this timeline. By 1750, when our timeline's Britain is on the cusp of industrialization, Spain's Europe is still largely pre-industrial. Agriculture is the dominant sector. Manufacturing exists but is small-scale and guild-controlled. Technology advances slowly. Industrialization does eventually come, but not until the mid-19th century, and it comes differently. It's introduced from the top down by the Spanish state, which recognizes that it needs to modernize to compete globally. Factories are established, railways are built, but they're state projects, not the product of private entrepreneurship. By 1900, Europe in this timeline is industrialized, but it's decades behind where our timeline's Europe was, and the Industrial Revolution, when it came, reinforced rather than challenged the existing power structures. The wealth generated by industry flowed to the Spanish crown and to the aristocratic and bureaucratic elites who controlled it. In our timeline, the Enlightenment of the 18th century was a transformative intellectual movement. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, and Kant questioned traditional authority, championed reason and science, and advocated for individual rights and democratic governance. The Enlightenment laid the philosophical foundation for the American and French revolutions and for modern democracy. But in the timeline where Spain dominates Europe, the Enlightenment is suppressed. The Spanish crown and the Catholic Church view Enlightenment ideas as threats. Books by Enlightenment thinkers are banned. Authors are imprisoned or forced to flee. The few who publish do so anonymously or in underground networks. Some Enlightenment ideas do circulate, particularly among educated elites, but they don't gain the same traction. Without the political and intellectual diversity of our timeline's Europe, without the competition between nations and between religious traditions, there's less space for new ideas to flourish. This has profound effects on political development. In our timeline, the late 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of democratic and liberal movements. The American Revolution in 1776 the French Revolution in 1789, the revolutions of 1848. These movements challenged monarchies and aristocracies, and over time, established democratic systems. In the Spanish-dominated timeline, these revolutions either don't happen or are quickly suppressed. There are occasional uprisings, protests, and demands for reform. But the Spanish Empire has the military and administrative power to crush them. By 1900, Europe is still governed by an absolute monarchy based in Madrid. There's no democracy, no parliament with real power, no universal suffrage. In our timeline, the 20th century was defined by two world wars. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and escalated due to complex alliances and imperial rivalries. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, was caused by unresolved tensions from the First War, economic depression, and the rise of fascism. But in the timeline where Spain controls Europe, these wars don't happen in the same way. Why not? Because Europe is not divided into competing nation-states. It's a single empire. There are still conflicts, certainly. There are rebellions in various parts of the empire. There are wars with other powers, particularly Russia, the Ottoman Empire, or its successor states, and potentially the United States. But there's no intra-European great power conflict. Without the world wars, the 20th century is very different. There's no massive destruction of European cities, no Holocaust, no division of Europe between East and West during a Cold War. But there's also less political and social change. The wars, for all their horror, accelerated decolonization, expanded rights for women and minorities, and led to the creation of international institutions like the United Nations. In the Spanish-dominated timeline, these changes come much more slowly or not at all. By the year 2000 in this alternate timeline, what does the world look like? Europe is still governed by the Spanish monarchy. Though the system has evolved, the empire is now a constitutional monarchy, with reforms introduced gradually over the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a parliament, but it has limited powers. The king retains executive authority. Suffrage is restricted. Only property owners and the educated can vote. The empire is wealthy but unequal. The aristocracy and the Catholic Church own vast estates. A small middle class exists in cities, but most people are workers or peasants with limited rights and opportunities. Social mobility is minimal. You're generally born into a class and remain there. Technologically, the empire is advanced, but not as advanced as our timeline's developed world. Industrialization came late and was less dynamic. Innovation is stifled by bureaucracy and the conservatism of the ruling elites. Computers exist, but are primarily used by the military and large corporations. The internet exists, but is heavily censored. Surveillance is pervasive. Culturally, Europe is monolithic. Catholicism dominates. The Church controls education and much of cultural life. Regional languages and cultures have been suppressed over centuries. Spanish is the official language everywhere, though local languages survive in rural areas. Art and literature exist, but are conservative, focused on religious themes and glorifying the monarchy and empire. Globally, the Spanish Empire is one of several major powers. The United States exists and is powerful, though it's smaller and less influential than in our timeline. Without World War II to make it a superpower, America is a regional power in the Western Hemisphere. Russia, or whatever state succeeded the Russian Empire, is another major power. China is rising. But Spain, controlling Europe and much of the colonial world, is the most powerful single state. The empire's colonies have mostly gained independence by 2000, but the process was slow and often violent. Decolonization didn't happen in the mid-20th century as in our timeline. Instead, it occurred gradually from the 1920s through the 1980s, and many former colonies remain economically dependent on Spain. The world in this timeline is more authoritarian, more hierarchical, more traditional. Democracy is rare. Most countries are either monarchies, dictatorships, or oligarchies. Human rights as we understand them, universal principles of freedom and dignity, don't have the same force. Rights are privileges granted by governments, not inherent to individuals. And by 2000, tensions are rising. In the early 21st century, the Spanish Empire faces unprecedented challenges. The first is demographic. Europe's population is aging and declining. Birth rates have fallen as urbanization and education have increased. The empire needs workers, but immigration is tightly controlled. Non-Europeans are viewed with suspicion. The result is labor shortages and economic stagnation. The second challenge is technological. While the empire has computers and the internet, it's fallen behind other regions. The United States, less constrained by tradition and autocracy, has developed more advanced information technology. China, having industrialized rapidly in the late 20th century, is a leader in manufacturing and now in innovation. The Spanish Empire's conservative institutions and heavy censorship limit its ability to compete. The third challenge is political. A new generation, born in the late 20th century, is questioning the system. They're more educated, more connected through underground internet networks, more aware of alternatives. They see that other parts of the world, America, parts of Asia, have more freedom, more opportunity, more dynamism. They want change. By 2020, protests are occurring across Europe. They start in universities, with students demanding academic freedom and an end to censorship. They spread to workers demanding better wages and working conditions. And they grow into broader movements calling for democracy, human rights, and an end to the monarchy. The Spanish government's response is initially repressive. Protests are broken up by police. Leaders are arrested. Media coverage is suppressed. But the protests continue and grow. By 2023, the empire is in crisis. The king, an aging man who has ruled for 30 years, is urged by advisors to grant reforms. But he's hesitant. He fears that any concession will lead to the empire's unraveling. The aristocracy and the church also oppose reforms, seeing them as threats to their power and privileges. But there are reformers within the government, younger officials who recognize that change is necessary. They argue that the empire must adapt or face revolution. They propose a new constitution, expanding the parliament's powers, introducing universal suffrage, and guaranteeing civil liberties. The king is torn. Make concessions and risk losing control, or crack down and risk provoking a broader uprising. In the fall of 2024, the king makes a decision. He will put the question to the people. A referendum will be held across the empire. The question: should the empire adopt a new democratic constitution, or should the traditional system be maintained? It's a calculated risk. The king believes that most people, particularly older generations and those in rural areas, are conservative. They value stability and tradition. They'll vote to maintain the system, and that vote will give the monarchy legitimacy and quiet the protests. But the reformers and the protest movements see the referendum as an opportunity. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people will have a voice. They campaign vigorously for the yes vote, for democracy. The campaign is intense. The government and the church campaign for no, arguing that the traditional system has brought prosperity and order. They warn that democracy will lead to chaos, to the empire's fragmentation, to economic collapse. The reformers argue that democracy is the only way forward, that the empire must evolve or it will fall, that people deserve rights and freedoms. The referendum is scheduled for December 15, 2024. As the date approaches, polls show the vote is too close to call. It could go either way. On December 14th, the day before the vote, something unexpected happens. The military, which has been silent throughout the crisis, issues a statement. The generals announce that they will respect the outcome of the referendum. If the people vote for democracy, the military will support the transition. If they vote to maintain the traditional system, the military will support that as well. This statement is crucial. It removes the fear of a military coup. It signals that the transition, whatever form it takes, will be peaceful, and it may sway some voters who were hesitant about change. That night, millions across Europe watch their televisions and devices. The empire, which has endured for over 4 centuries, is at a turning point. The next morning, polling stations open. Turnout is expected to be high. The world watches. Because if Europe, the continent that colonized much of the world, the heart of the Spanish Empire, votes for democracy, it will be a seismic shift. Other authoritarian regimes in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, will face pressure. The global balance could shift. But if Europe votes to maintain the traditional system, it will be a validation of authoritarianism, a signal that democracy is not universal, that some societies prefer order and tradition to freedom. By evening, the votes are being counted. The results will be announced at midnight. News organizations across the world broadcast live. Analysts debate what the outcome will mean. At 11 p.m., early results start to leak. Some regions have voted strongly for democracy. Others have voted to maintain tradition. But the overall tally is close. Very close. At midnight, the official responsible for announcing the results steps to the podium. The world watches. The votes have been counted, he says. The turnout was 78%, the highest in our empire's history, and the result is 50.2% have voted in favor of the new democratic constitution. 49.8% have voted to maintain the traditional system. There's a moment of stunned silence, and then chaos. In the streets, celebrations erupt in some cities. In others, there's anger and disbelief. The empire is divided, almost exactly in half. The king addresses the nation. He's solemn. The people have spoken. By the narrowest of margins, they have chosen to adopt the new constitution. As king, I will honor this decision. The transition to democracy will begin. But he continues, and his next words chill the celebration. However, I must also acknowledge that nearly half of our citizens voted to maintain our traditional system. They fear that this change will bring instability and chaos, and they may be right. The next months and years will test whether we can make this transition peacefully. I call on all citizens, whether they voted yes or no, to come together, to respect the outcome, to work toward a better future. But I cannot guarantee what that future will hold. The broadcast ends, and across the empire, people are left with uncertainty. The vote has passed, but barely. Nearly half the empire opposes the change. Will they accept it, or will they resist? In the days following the referendum, tensions remain high. In some regions, particularly in Spain itself and in parts of southern Europe, there are protests by those who voted no. They argue that the vote was manipulated, that foreign powers influenced the outcome, that the result should not be honored. In other regions, particularly in England, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, there are celebrations. Democracy has finally come after centuries of autocratic rule. The military, true to its word, does not intervene. But there are reports of divisions within the military. Some officers support democracy. Others remain loyal to the traditional system. If the situation escalates, the military could fracture. By early January 2025, the empire is implementing the new constitution. A provisional government is formed. Elections are scheduled for June. Political parties are being organized, many for the first time. There's excitement, but also fear. And then, on January 12th, an incident occurs that threatens to plunge the empire into civil war. In Seville, in southern Spain, a large protest is held by opponents of the new constitution. They're demanding a new referendum, arguing that the first was invalid. Tens of thousands gather in the city center. The protest is mostly peaceful, but there are some clashes with police. As evening falls, the crowd begins to disperse. But a group of several hundred, more radical, marches toward a government building. They're chanting, demanding that the king revoke the constitution. Police form a line to block them. The crowd presses forward. The police push back. And then, shots are fired. Who fired first is never definitively determined, but within seconds, a firefight erupts. Police shoot into the crowd. Some protesters, armed, shoot back. By the time order is restored, 23 people are dead. Over 100 are injured. The Seville massacre, as it's immediately called, dominates the news. The provisional government condemns the violence and promises an investigation. But the opposition blames the government, arguing that it provoked the protest and then used excessive force. Protests and counter-protests erupt across the empire. There are clashes in Madrid, Lisbon, Paris, and London. The situation is spiraling. Some call for the king to declare a state of emergency and suspend the new constitution. Others demand that the king abdicate, that the transition to democracy be accelerated. On January 20th, 2025, the king convenes an emergency meeting of the provisional government, military leaders, and representatives from across the empire. The meeting is held in secret in the royal palace in Madrid. The discussions are heated. Some argue for crackdown, for using the military to restore order and delay the democratic transition. Others argue for acceleration, for holding elections immediately to establish a legitimate democratic government. The king listens, and then he speaks. We are at a crossroads. If we crack down, we betray the referendum. We tell the people their vote meant nothing. We invite rebellion. But if we continue as planned, we risk chaos. The country is divided. Violence is escalating. We may not be able to hold elections in this environment. He looks around the room. I am asking for your counsel. What should we do? The military commander speaks first. Your Majesty, the military can restore order, but only if you give us clear authority. If you declare a state of emergency, suspend the Constitution for 6 months, we can suppress the protests and stabilize the situation. Then, when things are calm, we can proceed with the transition. A reformer, a young member of the provisional government, responds. With respect, General, that path leads to disaster. If we suspend the Constitution now, we lose all legitimacy. The protests will not stop. They will intensify, and we will have civil war. Then what do you propose? The king asks. Move forward. Hold the elections as scheduled. Yes, there's risk. But the only way out of this crisis is through democracy. Give the people a legitimate government, and the protests will subside. Those who voted no will accept the outcome once they see democracy in action. The debate continues for hours. No consensus is reached. Finally, the king says, I will make my decision by tomorrow. This meeting is adjourned. That night, the king sits alone in his study. He's 70 years old. He's ruled the empire for 3 decades. He never imagined his reign would end like this, with the empire on the brink of civil war, with the system that has endured for over 4 centuries on the verge of collapse or transformation. He thinks about his ancestors, the kings who built this empire, who conquered Europe and ruled it for generations. What would they want him to do? Preserve the system, or allow it to evolve? He thinks about his people, the millions who voted yes, who want democracy, and the millions who voted no, who want tradition. How can he serve both? As dawn breaks, he makes his decision. He calls his advisors and tells them he will address the nation at noon. At noon on January 21st, 2025, the king appears on television. He's seated at his desk, the flag of the empire behind him. He looks tired, but resolute. My fellow citizens, he begins, these past weeks have been among the most difficult in our empire's history. We held a referendum. The people chose democracy, but the margin was narrow, and many do not accept the result. Violence has erupted. Our empire is divided. I have spent these past days listening to advisors, to military leaders, to citizens from across the empire, and I have made a decision. I will not suspend the Constitution. I will not delay the transition. The elections will proceed as scheduled in June. Democracy will come to this empire as the people have voted. However, I also recognize that nearly half of our citizens oppose this change. I hear their concerns, and so I am announcing that I will not run for president. Under the new Constitution, the king becomes a ceremonial figure, and a president is elected. I will not seek that office. I will allow the people to choose their leader without my influence. Furthermore, I am establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission This commission will investigate the violence in Seville and elsewhere. It will hold accountable those responsible, and it will work to heal the divisions in our society. Finally, I am calling on all citizens, whether they supported the new constitution or opposed it, to participate in the democratic process. If you opposed democracy, run for office, campaign, persuade your fellow citizens, let the people decide. That is what democracy means. Our empire has endured for over 4 centuries. It has survived wars, rebellions, economic crises. It will survive this transition, but only if we all commit to it. Only if we choose dialogue over violence. Only if we respect each other, even when we disagree. The future of this empire is no longer mine to determine. It is yours, and I pray that you choose wisely. The address ends, and the empire and the world is left with uncertainty. Will the elections in June proceed peacefully? Will those who opposed democracy accept the results? Will the empire hold together, or will it fragment into separate nations? The Spanish Empire has ruled Europe for over 400 years. It conquered nations, suppressed dissent, and built one of the most powerful states in history. But now, in 2025, it faces its greatest challenge: the will of its own people. In our timeline, Spain never conquered Europe. The continent remained divided, competitive, and eventually democratic. But in this alternate timeline, Spain's domination delayed democracy for centuries, and now, as democracy finally arrives, the question is whether it comes too late, whether the divisions created by centuries of autocratic rule are too deep to bridge. The elections are scheduled for June 1st, 2025, 5 months away, and in those 5 months, the fate of the empire will be decided. Will the Spanish Empire survive as a unified, democratic state, or will it collapse, fragmenting into the nations that Spain conquered centuries ago, each seeking its own identity? Will democracy take root, or will authoritarianism reassert itself, as it has so many times in history? The referendum was a beginning, not an ending, and the story is far from over. One conquest, beginning in the 16th century, changed the course of history. It delayed democracy. It suppressed diversity. It created an empire that dominated Europe and much of the world for over 4 centuries. But empires, no matter how powerful, do not last forever. And the Spanish Empire, in January 2025, stands at the edge of transformation or collapse. 5 months, and we will know which. The world watches, the empire waits, and history, as always, remains unwritten.